It's a phrase that Warren had used, I think, in print at some time, in which he said that his whole life was focused on Berkshire, and he said, "I love my work so much. I describe myself as tap dancing to work," and um, uh, and so when we were searching for a title for the book, and some very inappropriate ones were coming up, I suddenly thought of this one, and I thought, that's it. And fortunately, Warren agreed, and the publisher agreed too. Warren loved it from the minute he said that I'm in for that. It just as appropriate as it has always been. He truly loves to do what he does. I speak to Warren a lot. First of all, there are a couple of things that we do during the year that I participate in. So I'm always involved over November and December and January and February with the annual letter. That's a lot of work between the two of us. He writes it, I edit it, I send it back to him. He makes some suggestions, some changes according to what I've suggested. He sends it back to me. I make some of the same. We were playing bridge at Kay Graham's apartment in New York, over on the east side. I think the other two players were probably my husband, John Loomis, and a friend of ours, George Gillespie, although the constitution of the bridge game sometimes changed. And they wanted a picture for Fortune magazine where I worked. And they said, let's get one at the bridge table. So I went over and sat down and pulled my cards back, tried to look like exactly like we were playing. And Warren, on the spur of the moment, leaned over to look at my cards, and I broke into laughter. It was perfect. It was a great example of his sense of humor, which is very, very extraordinary. When people say things to him, his instinctive wish is to say something funny back. And he manages to do that a greater number of times than almost any person I know. I first came to hear about Warren Buffett when my husband, who has always worked in Wall Street jobs and was working for a small institutional firm at that time, was assigned the Midwest to cover. And he read about Warren, never had heard of him. Here was this fellow in Omaha who seemed to be making a move in investments. And John wrote him a letter and said, I'm going to be in Omaha on Monday. Could I possibly come over to see you? And to me, the amazing fact is that Warren saw John because he never got his ideas from security salesmen. And yet here he was, willing to have John stop by. And they went out to lunch, had a good time. I'm sure that John told him I worked for Fortune. I'm sure that Warren was immediately interested because he has said that if he hadn't been an investor, he might have been a journalist. And that would have been a great loss for the investment world, but a really great gain for the journalist world. And so when he and Susie, his late wife Susie, came to New York not very long after that, they asked us to have lunch. And first, John came back from this meeting with Warren and said, I think I may have met the smartest investor in the country. And I'm sure I rolled my eyes like wives do when their husbands overstate things. But I said, oh, yes, okay. And then when we went to lunch with Susie and Warren a couple of months later, I said, this guy is the smartest investor in the country. If not the smartest guy, I've never been sure that it's only limited to investments. Well, about investments, his father once said of him, that boy can see around corners where investments are concerned. And I do think that he does have a vision for investments that other people find it extremely hard to duplicate. And he has a philosophy to go with it. And he sticks to the philosophy. And he's incredibly patient, which most investors are not. That is a big failing of investors. And then he knows business so well. He has a better grasp of business than anybody I know of all businesses. And if it's one that he doesn't know, he's willing to take the time to learn it. He's willing to be patient about that. And he brings this incisive mind to the job. His IQ is off the charts. All the Buffett children were tested for their IQ when they were kids. I'm not sure that Warren was even the highest. The girls, I think, were extremely high. But his IQ is way, way up there. And he has the ability to use it in ways that are beyond other people. He's amazing. Warren's childhood was, as indeed, I did not know him at all at the time, so I only know what I've heard. He was not close to his mother. He never would talk very much, at least to me, about the relationships between him and his mother. He was extremely close to his father. His father was his hero. I think he was a hero to his sisters also. But Warren grew up thinking of his father as the man he would most like to emulate. And it was something has never left him to this day, that he says that his father influenced him immeasurably and installed in him a code of ethics that he's never, ever stopped following. I did meet his mother. At one time, as a matter of fact, I made a special effort to interview her. I thought at one time I might write a book about Warren. As I've described it, it was all hat and no cattle, and we never ended up doing it, primarily because he didn't want to put the time in that it would have taken into just knowing how many hours he would have to be thinking about the book, even though I was going to write it. And but anyway, for that, I interviewed his mother. It was probably the second time I had met her. Interviewed Bertie, his younger sister, and so I did talk to his mother. I came away with the feeling that she didn't influence him very much. I think there was a gap between them, and he was. He and his mother sort of got along. Well, they didn't get along, but they sort of lived parallel lives, and he was mainly influenced by his father, very much so. I think that one thing they would be most surprised to know about Warren if they didn't know him and hadn't read is that he loves prize fights, boxing. He watches every Friday night. He has even had Floyd Mayweather, the boxer, on a Buffett movie. That just always has struck me as one of those idiosyncratic things that you just can't quite imagine for Warren Buffett. Um, I don't. Otherwise, his personality is sort of out there. What you see is what you get. When he says that business is a game that he plays, I think he means that he's not in it for the money, but that it's the most astounding game that exists for anybody who has his talents and his interests. And he enjoys playing it better than anybody else has. And it's extraordinary what he's accomplished. Berkshire is an amazing company. It's fourth largest company in the Fortune 500. He is the only person, I should say, in the history of the Fortune 500, which is now more than 50 years old, and who has ever, from scratch, from a tiny little company, built a company that is in the top 10 of the Fortune 500. Berkshire Hathaway is an amazing company, and sometimes I think that people don't realize just exactly how amazing it is. Well, Warren Buffett is probably the most rational person I've ever met. Charlie Munger would be a close rival. Maybe one would have the edge, and most people are not as rational as Warren and Charlie are. And so I think that when he was dealing with people, he was expecting rationality, and they were not behaving that way. So I think that was what and they would say things also that they did not, that were, they would say things that were not exactly honest, knowing that they weren't going to quite live up to them. Whereas he always knew that what he was going to do, he was going to live up to. And I think those were things that he found it hard to accommodate in the way that other people reacted. Warren's values are to be very honest, to do what you're going to say. When Berkshire Hathaway makes a bid for a company, there are people who are out there in the world who think that somehow this bid isn't going to go through. And the fact is, that bid is always going to be accomplished, always going to be followed through on. And so that's a big part of his values. His values are to never equivocate. Although he has a great deal of judgment about how to handle people, and so he may be very tactful in what he says. But basically, he wants to lead a life that he and his father, if his father was still living, would say was a good one. And his values extend through all of his life. he he does not have one personality that he brings to business and one personality that he takes home. That is absolutely not the way he is. He's got a set of values that he sticks to. Susie was one of the warmest and charming people that I've ever met. She was extremely empathetic. She had a great interest in other people. She could have been a journalist in one way, because Warren used to talk about that if Susie sat by somebody at the end of at a dinner, that a half an hour later they had taken her into their complete confidence, and they would know that she would go home thinking about it. And very smart, very interested in doing the right things and using the money that the Buffetts came to have in ways that would be beneficial for people who weren't so lucky. She was an extraordinary person. I absolutely would say that Susie led Warren toward interacting socially. and changing his political views. He grew up as a young Republican. His father was a Republican congressman. Warren had nothing in his early life that would suggest he could have been a strong Democrat. But Susie saw things in different ways and led him toward changing his political views. And he certainly has stuck with them now for an enormously long time. It's possible that he would have changed without Susie, but I sort of doubt it. She was the catalyst. I didn't know Warren when all of this was occurring, but the tales I've heard, I think he was a strange kid. In some ways, he was beyond his years. When he was young, he could talk to adults, and they loved him. As a matter of fact, here was some smart kid. He was funny. They really loved how he was, but I think he was a little bizarre in some ways. And when he went to interview for Harvard Business School, I think he was 15. And he has said he looked like he was 12. And he didn't get accepted, which of course the Harvard Business School has never been able to live down. And I think he takes a kind of a joy in that he couldn't get into Harvard Business School. But I think she made him into a much more normal kind of person. She changed his political sensibilities. She was always there for him whenever he needed to turn to her, and he was extremely dependent on Susie and what she was like. I think that part of Warren's success comes from the fact that he does not have the same emotional currents affecting his investment decisions as other people do. He tries to extract emotion from his investment decisions. This is part of his rationality. Certainly, that's a key part of being rational. And but I think that sometimes he may overstate that too. He hates to fire people. Emotions certainly come into that. He's very caring about his employees, so that I don't think that he just erases emotion from what he does. But in his investment decisions, it is essential to the decisions he's making. If he wished not to be emotional, and which I think he does, I don't think he succeeds completely because he does have these things that infringe on his decisions. Warren's opinions of the Wall Street investment bankers would not endear him to their mothers. He feels that they're, for the most part, not out for their clients. They're out for their own business interests. I don't think he thinks that their honesty is always great. So he is not a general admirer of Wall Street bankers. I think that certain investment bankers knew how smart Warren was. I remember Bruce Wasserstein, a very famous Wall Streeter, saying that you have to be very careful when negotiating with Warren because he's so smart that he'll pick you if you're not careful. And and also Warren was always more inflexible than an investment banker would want him to be. He'd name a price on a business, and he thought that was the price that the business was worth, and he wouldn't budge from that. And Wall Street bankers really like people who negotiate. Warren is not a negotiator. I'm just thinking he and Don Trump would not be exactly on the same wavelength about negotiating. When Warren made his investment in Salomon, I was one of the people along with many, many others who were quite amazed because he had taken a very critical tone in talking about investment bankers and about their greed. And here he was investing in one, Salomon Brothers, that was known to be a member of the club. It just didn't quite add up. But there was a man then running Salomon, John Goodfriend, that Warren had had business dealings with, and had found John always to be honest and forthcoming and beneficial to the client, and that was very important for Warren. He is if somebody has treated him honestly and expertly, he is likely to come back and respond. When Solomon's problems erupted, my memory is that Warren first learned about it while he was in Las Vegas, except he really didn't quite understand what the problems were at the time. And he had gone to Las Vegas with a family named Blumkin, who ran the Nebraska Furniture Mart, and it was a once a year expedition that they all looked forward to. And he got a call and went out into a pay telephone. He got a call about Salomon, went to a pay telephone to understand that there was something very important that John Goodfriend wanted to talk to him about. And he had no idea what it was and did not learn that evening really what it was. The problem at Salomon that Warren eventually learned about was that an important employee of Salomon's had basically lied to the Federal Reserve about Solomon's accumulation of a certain issue of government bonds. And the lying to the Fed was just not something that was done. It was an egregious crime, and once it was discovered by management at Salomon, it had been covered up. They never thought of it that way, but it was covered up, and the Fed did not learn what had happened. There was a letter from the Federal Reserve to the management of Salomon saying that the crime had been a grievous crime, and that it was likely that the Fed would have to take action about this. And the Fed assumed that the letter had gone to the board of directors. Warren was not a part of management at this time. The company was run by John Goodfriend. And, but the board never saw this letter. So there were conversations that Warren engaged in after that where mysterious references were made to a letter that he had no idea what they were talking about. It was like two people were talking right by each other. And it was only much later that he learned about the letter. When Solomon's problems erupted, Warren was in Omaha doing his usual thing of running Berkshire Hathaway, making one big decision a year, as he has sometimes said. And he was on the phone with John Goodfriend and Tom Strauss, the number 2 guy at Salomon. And it became clear to Warren during that conversation, as I remember it on a Friday morning, that somebody needed to step in to run Salomon. There was a need, and he was the logical guy to do it. To this day, I think that Warren thinks he suggested that he come to New York to start running Salomon. I think John Goodfriend, who just recently died, might say that it was his idea for Warren to do this. But at any rate, the upshot was that Warren, if this happened on a Friday, by Saturday he was in New York, and by Sunday he was appearing before the press as the new acting CEO of Salomon. There was an important moment in this whole Salomon affair in which Warren called Nick Brady, who was the Secretary of the Treasury. Nick Brady was at the horse races in Saratoga. And I guess he was pulled out of the stands to take this call. And Warren told him that if the Fed went through with its threat that it was going to change Solomon's status and not allow it to not allow it to sell and trade in government bonds, that it would destroy Solomon. And Warren thought, and he still thinks to this day, he does think that if Solomon went down, it would take other important parts of Wall Street with it. And he said all of this to Nick Brady. And Nick kept saying, now, Warren, it's just, you're overstating this problem. It's going to be all right. They were old friends. And Warren kept saying to him, no, you don't understand. The matter is as serious as I'm saying it is to you, and you need to take some action. And when Nick Brady got off of the phone, he still hadn't been convinced, but events then began to change, and in time he did take some action. The threat from Treasury that made Warren think that it was so dire that Solomon could not take it was that Solomon would no longer be able to be a government trader. The Fed had that ability to say who could trade government bonds, and the Fed was in effect saying you're an evil force, and we don't want you trading our bonds. Warren said that it was the most important day in his life. I've always thought about that, just because I think the most important day of his life was when he married Susie, and I always wondered what Susie thought about that. Warren had always said that you can go through life building your reputation, and in 5 minutes it can be destroyed. And he believed that at that particular point, his reputation was on the line. He had not come in to take over Salomon Brothers to save it from bankruptcy. He had come in to keep it on its feet, get it restored as a trader of government bonds. And the thought that it was going to end up as bankruptcy was just unimaginable to him. And he told Nick Brady that he was not going to stay around to run it if it became bankrupt. And Nick Brady did not believe him. But I believe it would have happened. He would have said, I did not come to rescue Solomon with the thoughts that it was going to become bankrupt, and I'm not going to stay around. You can find somebody else for that. Well, in the end, the Fed did not. In the end, the Fed did not come forth with the most terrible thing it could do, which was to remove Solomon as a government trader. It relented to some point. It relented to some degree, and Solomon proceeded to, although its stock was wrecked at that point, had to come back from that, proceeded to behave pretty much as it had been. But the whole incident had been so extreme and so carried out in the public that the government called hearings, and Warren had to go down and testify, certainly for the first time that he'd ever had to do anything like that. He'd hardly been involved with anything that hadn't gone well up till that time, and here he was, the man on the spot, being called to testify at government hearings. And to this day, he uses that episode, the televised episode, as he began. It goes in every Berkshire movie because he wants the people who work for him, the managers of his business, to hear that every year. Extraneous. I always argue that it's time to take it out. I don't get any place. he has said that if it's a mistake, if a Solomon employee makes a mistake, he will understand. If he if he does something that could land up on the front page of the New York Times, he will be unforgiving. He will be ruthless. And it was a big word. I argued at the time it was too big a word. I was having conversations with Warren during this period. First of all, he was in New York, um, uh, and I saw him maybe once or twice in New York. There was a shareholder meeting while all of this was going on. I went to that, and during his famous press conference on Sunday, right after he had become acting CEO of Salomon, I was at that press conference. So I was very tuned in to what was going on. I was nervous for him. On the other hand, I think he is so capable of handling almost any situation that I thought he would I thought he would do it. This one was putting strains on him that he had never had before. But when a question came up at the press conference about how he was going to handle the fact that he had this big company in Omaha and he was going to be in New York handling Solomon, he said, "Well, my mother has sewn my name on my underwear, so it's going to be okay." Warren did decided from the or said from the very beginning that if he took over at Solomon, first of all, he hoped it would be temporary, and he would be taking no money from Solomon. He was a dollar a year man, I guess, in the a sense that that word is often used. Um, he never took any money for it, and people said, "Well, of course he's doing this because of his large stake in Salomon Brothers." And I never believed that was true. I believed, of course, he wouldn't have been in the position if he hadn't had that large stake because there wouldn't have been any dialogue between him and John Goodfriend. But I never believed that. It was a potential blot on his life. He did not want this to happen. He wanted to save the firm, and I think the money that Berkshire had in it was a very much of a secondary matter. Well, when Warren took the job at Salomon, yeah, he had once said uh, that he was, if he made one good business decision at Berkshire a year, he was doing his job. Solomon required him to make one decision after another every day, 100, maybe not 100 a day, but certainly 10 big ones a day. And it was a world that he wasn't totally familiar with. Um, but he did it because he knew that somebody had to do it, and as he said, I was the right person. In this world where he had to make all these decisions, where he had to deal with people who were very, very greedy, where he could not even make any headway against a compensation system that was pretty egregious and is still today being fought over. He knew that he was the right place. Omaha, all of his life, had been the place he wanted to be, and he knew that the work that he was doing at Berkshire, which he never considered work, it was part of his tap dancing to work routine. He knew that how lucky he'd been that he was not in this environment, and that he was going to return to the environment that was perfect for him. We'll never know what would have happened if Solomon had gone down, but Warren believed, and still believes to this day, that it was an integral part of a Wall Street where promises are taken for granted, and people trade every day on the theory that they will get paid. He felt that the infrastructure there was not set up for a severe shock like Solomon going down. And on that Sunday, when all of this was being debated as what would happen, the key point was that the Japanese market was going to open that night. And if the Solomon situation was still as severe as the Fed wanted it to be, Warren believed that trading in Japan would be really affected, and then it would just roll around the world. And he believed that there was a too big to fail scenario. The term was not used then like it later came to be in 2008, but he believed that Solomon was too big to fail and that it would fail if the Fed stuck to its dictum that it was to be removed from trading. Unfortunately, my total exposure to Ben Graham was hearing a speech of his at one day. But he believed that he basically coined the term value investing. He believed in a careful scrutiny of a company's financial statements, decisions based on the probability that this was a company that could survive under any circumstances, and the belief that if you bought value, it would eventually prove out. And one of his dictums that Warren has said is the two rules of investing, according to Warren, and I think he got this from Ben Graham. The first rule is never lose money, and the second rule is never forget the first rule. When Warren was first into the investments, and he learned this from Ben Graham, he was in his investments often were to buy a company that you could figure was a discarded cigar butt, but it had one more smoke in it. And he wanted to buy at the right time to be able to pull out the one smoke, to be able to benefit from the one smoke. And so the discarded cigar butt theory was one that he used at the beginning of his investment life. Warren, if he bought a discarded cigar butt company, would certainly make himself known to the management of that company, would state his opinions as to what might be good for it, and would hang around, looking for the last puff from the cigar butt. The cigar butt theory only was important if you were dealing with small companies. You just couldn't expand that into and multiply that into large acquisitions. And Warren would have continued to be a small operator if he had stuck to the cigar butt theory. And he is an opportunist. He's always looking for the right opportunities. He's willing to have anybody bring a strange thought to him as to what he might do, and to move on it. And it just wasn't going to work to stick to discarded cigar butts if Berkshire was to be built into any kind of important company. What made the turn was that Warren got to know Charlie Munger, a California lawyer who had also grown up in Omaha, but the two young men had not known each other because Charlie was 8 years older than Warren, and they just didn't happen to. But they both worked for Warren's grandfather's grocery store, but at separate times, so they didn't know each other. And Charlie became Warren's sort of alter ego, and became a man that Warren depended on heavily just to discuss things with. Charlie's opinion was important. And Charlie felt and managed to convince Warren, and this was a real turning point in Warren's business life, that buying important companies, buying good companies, at fair prices was the way to proceed and leave the cigar butts in the gutter, if you'll pardon the expression. Charlie's influence on Warren and pushing him in the direction of good businesses at fair prices was a huge turning point for Warren and Berkshire. There's no telling what Berkshire would be today if that turn in events hadn't occurred. We'd all be poorer, that's for sure. And Warren has said that after he left the discarded cigar butt era, he was still drawn to them occasionally, but Charlie was keeping him, and Warren was learning increasingly that buying good companies at fair prices was the way to go. Warren's initial plan when he made the investment to buy Berkshire Hathaway was to end up selling his stock back to the company at a profit, and this could have happened. The company was at that time selling off a mill here and there, getting a little cash, paying a big dividend, and Warren was expecting to end up benefiting from this. Then the CEO of Berkshire Hathaway engaged in a little bit of chicanery, promising him one price for a tender offer that they were making. That was their way of buying in stock. And the CEO of Berkshire promised him one price and then went back on it. And that was just something that Warren couldn't live with, and so he changed his strategy. Seabury Stanton's change made Warren very, very angry. I imagine he was just about livid with anger. Warren took great offense at what Seabury Stanton did. Warren did not like two-timing of any kind. He probably did not, in this case, probably did not put quite enough study into what he was actually buying, but he made an effort. He changed his strategy and became to think that he would take over control of Berkshire Hathaway because the CEO, Seabury Stanton, had cheated him or gone back on his promise. And so he ended up buying this textile company, which was not in great shape, and which Warren has said was the biggest mistake he ever made, was buying this textile company, or getting control of it, not buying it. As Warren got into Berkshire Hathaway, I think he realized its frailties. He worked hard to make the company do the right, go down the right road, but to the extent that it was throwing off cash, he wasn't going to put it back into textiles. And in the first of Berkshire's ability to take cash and use it in an important and constructive way in other businesses. He took cash from Berkshire Hathaway and moved it into insurance. And insurance turned out to be just ideal for Warren. It itself accumulated cash or threw off cash, and so that was the beginning of Warren's ability to build a large company from this company that he really claims was a mistake to buy in the first place. And he stuck with the company. He wanted it to succeed. He really did. He didn't want those people, those employees who were going to be thrown out of work. He did not want that to happen. So he stuck with it longer than he probably should have. But finally, he had to concede that the mills must be shut down. The mill must be shut down, and the textile business disappeared. When Warren started investing, he he sometimes, and I would say pretty often, had the intention of liquidating the company. He felt that the cost of gaining control of the company was not as much as the assets of the company, and that there was a profit to be made there. And his intention was to move forward with liquidating companies. This wouldn't always have been the case, but often. Um, but I think his first experiences in that business, so to speak, convinced him that it was not exactly where he wanted to be. I mean, there was a small company called Dempster in Nebraska. It was a small town whose population depended heavily on this company existing, and closing it down, liquidating it was a lot of pain for. And he was not a man who enjoyed causing pain. And Susie was probably at home saying, "Oh, I'm so sorry about all those people there." I know it was that his father's death was a huge sadness for Warren. He'd been so close to his father. They worked together. He'd been as a young boy. He had worked sometimes at his father's brokerage office. And he admired his father and his standards so greatly that to have this person leave his life was amazing, was so hard for him. He actually has not been happy to talk about it because it was a huge calamity for him to deal with. But Warren has the ability to pick himself up from things and move forward. He's amazing that way. Warren definitely has a tendency to look forward and to think optimistically. I don't think he could ever have gotten where he's gotten if he hadn't been an optimist. And he believes that there are pessimists around who don't understand facts as well as he does. And he is in the business of being a teacher, trying to straighten out the landscape for these people. Warren decided to close down his partnership in '69 because the late '60s were a period of enormous speculation, and stock prices had gotten to levels that Warren just could not understand in many cases that people were buying. He said, "I just don't understand this market, and I'm better getting out of it." And so he just chose to close down the hedge fund, which is what it was. And Berkshire, meanwhile, was there. He'd taken control of that in 1965. People used to write how he had left the investment business, and I used to laugh at that because he hadn't left the investment business. He just changed the party that through which he was doing it. And so he just said, "There's idiocy out here in the stock market, and I don't really want to have a part of it." Becoming Warren Buffett is that's a long period of years in which he was becoming Warren Buffett. And he was not the statesman that he now is when he started out. Of course, he was so young that no one would have accepted him as a statesman anyway. But he has developed over the years so much. He's broadened. That is the best word for him. Has broadened in ways that have made him a different man. I think my expression was that fortune, for which I worked, was lucky to have been standing alongside Warren Buffett while he was becoming Warren Buffett. He changed. Not only that, he kept creating, journalists love this, kept creating new stories. And he was never dull. You knew that just when you thought you understood the kind of thing that Warren Buffett was going to do, he would come up with something new. and for a journalistic organization to be standing alongside him while he did that, and to have some pretty good access, because I had known him for so long, was a wonderful thing. Warren was quite an expert about newspapers. He bought the Buffalo Evening News, and and he he um, he got interested in the Post because he recognized it as a greatly undervalued company. And he got to know Kay Graham, told her he had no evil intentions at all, and he was going to he wasn't going to try to tell her what she should do in her newspaper. And it, it was a great investment opportunity for him. And if there was something else, I don't know what it was. That Nixon's, the political strife that the Washington Post entered into hurt its value, and made most people run from the stock. And the stock went way down to levels that were almost unconscionable. And Warren realized how very low it was, and so he has always wanted to move into undervalued situations, and this was one that was right up there on the horizon for you to see. Kay Graham Warren did think she was undervalued. She'd been thrown into this job for which, in some senses, people would have said she had no background for. A very important journalistic job. She was not, she didn't have a lot of self-confidence. And so she needed constantly to have her self-confidence build up. She was not familiar with financial figures. Finance was not a big part of her life. And Warren was a teacher. He has said that that his ambition in life is to be a teacher. Kay Graham was one of his primary students. She said that she was going to the Buffett School of Business, which is kind of ludicrous considering that he couldn't get into Harvard Business School. And he had a great opportunity to influence the way that the Post was going to go, even though I don't mean that journalistically, because he was hands off entirely in what the Post was running. Kay Graham did introduce Warren to the world of Washington. And it was a little bit rocky at times. I think he turned up for one of his first dinners with her without a tuxedo, and they had to find a tuxedo on very short notice in Washington. But he enjoyed it. I think at first he probably felt like he was in a totally unfamiliar environment, and he was. But he could talk with the best of them, and he enjoyed it. And Kay had wonderful dinner parties, and so he liked it. I think the whole period after which he became involved with the Washington Post was important to his growth. He thought more broadly. His democratic inclinations, his political democratic inclinations were strengthening, and he was able to test them out, talking to people like the editorial editor of the Washington Post, Meg Greenfield. He was introduced to new people, entirely different group than he had ever dealt with before. And still, he wanted to go back to Omaha, but he didn't mind getting into Washington politics a little bit. I think of 1970 as being sort of the key year in which the conditions for women changed in the business world. Um, and Kay was getting involved at that time in the management of the Post. I was at Fortune. I never did think of myself as on any kind of battlefield there. I knew I'd been put into a job that most women didn't do, and I was enjoying that and trying to get better all the time. And Kay was a learner, and Warren. One thing I will say about Warren, among many, is that I have never ever met a business leader who is as unprejudiced as Warren is about gender or nationality, ethnic, anything. Warren has only one prejudice, and that is about intelligence. And he doesn't care where that turns up. Uh, it, and so I think of him as being more supportive of women over the years than any business executive I know, because many of big business executives that I respect for other reasons are just a little bit insensitive on the women front, and Warren has none of that. He has always been a supporter of women. For Berkshire, insurance is in itself a profitable business, particularly if it's well run. And Warren has had a real knack for getting good people to run his insurance companies. But it has the additional advantage of creating something that's called float. And float is the money that hangs around Berkshire while a claim is waiting to be paid. Eventually, somebody's going to get that claim payment. But in the meantime, the money is there that, in effect, has been reserved for payment and can be used by Berkshire to invest in other things. And Warren turned out to have a extraordinary ability to both run the insurance companies, accumulate float, and use the money thrown off both by the running and the float to buy companies that fed the growth of Berkshire. I think C's for Warren represented his departure from the cigar butt days to the time of buying good companies at fair prices. C's is a company that has thrown off money. I mean, it does not need a lot of capital investments. Historically, Warren has did try for many, many years to stay away from companies that required large amounts of capital investments. Eventually, to build Berkshire, he had to move into companies like the railroad and the utility that do require large capital expenditures. If Berkshire's growth would have stopped if he hadn't done that. But C's was a company that threw off all this money that could be used for other things. And meanwhile, was a wonderful company. People love it. I have some in the kitchen. And so it was a great acquisition for Warren, and one that I think he still feels very proud of today. I think that Warren could think of some of his investments as a comfort zone. He understands them, like Coca-Cola. He doesn't think they're going to go away because he himself could probably not exist if he didn't have frequent infusions of Coca-Cola. And so I think he does feel that knowing a business and knowing the kind that's not going to go away, can't be changed by technology. Those are important pegs for him to use when he's considering an investment. Absolutely. Warren's divisions of his life, the business life has always been the one that he focused on. And he was not, I think he probably would say this himself, he was not the most dedicated father who ever existed, although his kids all grew up to be wonderful people and wonderful admirers and very devoted to their father. But Warren's personal life did not include a lot of time spent away from the reading and the thinking about Berkshire that made it grow. He just wasn't built that way. Susie's leaving for California was kind of unprecedented as a way for a married couple to live because they continued to travel together after she was in California. Um, I think it was a great blow for Warren because he had depended on her so much. He had sort of she had filled in every emotional facet of his life, and it was it extraordinarily hard for him. On the other hand, he still had the business, and he could turn to that and draw from it the strength that it had always given him. It was most of his friends didn't quite understand what was going on, but it was something they managed to work out for a lot of years. In Omaha, she was always going to be Mrs. Buffett, Mrs. Warren Buffett. She had staked out her own area of philanthropy, but she needed time to she needed a different venue for her own interests, and I never had thought of it really, but I guess it could be because women were kind of reaching out in every direction. Warren was able to avoid the tech bubble because he recognized something about the tech companies that many people did not recognize and still don't. That technology changes, and that a company that is highly prosperous in 1985 or 1990 can be kind of thrown out. Let's talk about AOL. Think about AOL, where it stood in the late 80s, and the fact that it was soon to assume a much less important role, still around today. But Warren does not like to buy businesses that change. He likes businesses like, well, now Coca-Cola you can argue has changed because everybody's worrying about their weight. But he likes businesses that are going to continue to be there, to operate pretty much in the same way that they always have, and to turn out the good profits that they always have. So technology was too much change for him. He never knew where they were going to be 10 years from there. They might be great in year one, but year 10, they could have been even almost put out of business by change in technology. It wasn't for him. In the late 80s, he was pretty much said to be a has-been. People said it was all over for Warren Buffett. And he, just because he was not involved in technology, the technology bubble was forming. It was going to explode in the early 90s. And they just said, though, Warren Buffett doesn't know what he's doing. He's not with it. He's not cool. He is somebody that just has had his day and it's gone. Warren doesn't enjoy criticism, published criticism, any more than anybody else, I don't think. But I think that down deep, he knew that his methods were the right thing for him. He was not to be swerved into a different direction, and I don't see any sign that he changed his way of operating, so I don't think it got to him very much. It had to be a pretty long period in his life because it went on for a number of years. I remember that Charlie and he talked about that they both wanted to be around when the bubble burst because they just couldn't quite imagine how things had gotten as much out of kilter as they had. He hates to be misquoted, and um, and and Berkshire is a complicated company. So when when somebody at Berkshire Hathaway buys a stock, they always the headline writers intuitively turn to headlines that say uh, Buffett buys Apple, as we're hearing these days. There are now three buyers. There have always been at least two, or for many decades there have been at least two, but now there are three buyers. So it could easily be, and in the Apple investment, for example, was not Warren's investment at all. It was one of the two guys who worked for him, Ted Weschler and Todd Combs. And so it's easy for the press to get things wrong about Berkshire because it's a complicated company. And I do think that he would like to always be quoted accurately in the press and have Berkshire described in the way that it actually is happening. But he manages to, and I think that one of the reasons he's gone on television more is because he wanted to be able to explain himself. He didn't want to have the press standing interpreting what he was doing. He wanted to be the guy who was the explainer. And his speeches, which can be very complicated, are always done extemporaneously. And so they do not lend themselves to being put down in perfect order. I know this personally because I have had to take some of them and edit them into articles. But that's the way with extemporaneous speeches. But he has been on stage, public stage, a lot, and has grown to enjoy it, I would say. And now Charlie is growing to enjoy it also. Warren called me. It was I think I was not aware at the time she came to that Fortune conference of what she had just learned. She left very quickly after the conference. She told me that a friend of hers was ill. That was during the AIDS period, and she had some friends who were ill with AIDS. But now, even as we talk about it, I think probably it was because she herself was the one who was, she herself was the one who was ill and was going off to deal with it. And Warren, and I learned that Susie was ill when Warren called to tell me that she had throat cancer, and he was taking it pretty hard. He went to San Francisco every weekend for I don't know how long, but it was a long period. And it was not the normal kind of thing for him to do, but the circumstances, Susie being that ill, the brightening that I think it would have brought to her weekends when he was out there, I think he knew it was important. It was important for him too. I was playing golf I heard the news about Susie dying at Wingfoot Golf Club where I was playing golf. I walked off after a match. It was the women's tournament competition it has once a year, and I walked off after playing a match, and my daughter was standing there. And I looked at her, why was she there? And she said to me, Susie Buffett has died. And I said, oh my gosh, he'll never be able to stand this. That's what I said. I remember this perfectly. He got up and went back to work and recovered. Not recovered because he was still distraught by it, but he went back to work in a way that I could not have imagined that he would do. And I've heard his daughter Susie say I thought he might disappear into his bedroom and never come out. And the fact is, he picked himself up and resumed his life. After Susie's death, Warren definitely did throw himself back into his work uh, in a way that let him keep going in a forward sort of way. Um, I don't recall that I talked to him anymore. It was always, when I did talk to him, it was with a feeling of enormous sympathy because I knew what a void it would have been in his life. Well, I think that Warren's place in the pantheon of American businessmen is totally established. Um, I laugh a little bit at lists of leaders in business that need to change every year journalistically because you can't run the same list every year, and that leave Warren Buffett off because I think that he is without doubt the leading businessman of the country. Um, I think he is quite possibly, quite probably, going to be the only one that ends up in the history books. Although I recall saying this to a friend recently, and the friend said, when you're talking about 100 years from now, which is what you're saying, there aren't going to be any books. And I said, but I, I think he's going to end up in the history books 100 years from now. I'm not sure, though, what role he's going to be assigned. Will he be famous for what he did as an investor, as a businessman, because there is a difference, or as a philanthropist? And I'm just not sure which of those roles. Andrew Carnegie, more accurately, was a businessman before he was a philanthropist, but we remember him today as a philanthropist, and I'm just not sure how it's going to turn out. The shareholders, well, they range from people with not much money to hedge fund guys who are the richest and often considered the greediest of all kinds of businessmen. Um, I would say that an awful lot of the people that I've met out there have been people you like to spend your time around. And I've seen many letters that have come in to Warren after the meeting from people talking about how much they enjoyed the people they met, how much they liked the whole atmosphere, how friendly they think it is. Of course, that's a Midwestern trait anyway. And I think it's a congenial crowd that is drawn back just because it's not only Warren and Charlie up there, but the whole atmosphere of all these people who have had very good fortune in many cases because they've bought the stock, uh, but who sort of see themselves as part of something a little bit bigger than the stock. There is definitely a sense of a Buffett community with a Charlie Munger geography on the side, and these people, they don't sell their stock. If there were statistics about this, we would probably find that there are more long-term holders of Berkshire than any company. People consider it a religion. They don't want to. They don't. It's always been a mistake to sell Berkshire Hathaway, and so they don't want to be making the mistake now. And so they do see themselves as part of community, and Warren does everything he can to encourage that feeling because he regards shareholders as owners of the business, and he regards the smallest of them as equal in size to the biggest. Many questions that are asked, the questioner either asks for a response from both Warren and Charlie, or uh, Warren turns to Charlie, or Charlie intercedes to answer. And Warren's answers are always given with great tact. He's very careful how he answers questions. Charlie has no tact. I once wrote of him that he said that when they handed out humility, he didn't get his fair share. But he says what's on his mind, and he doesn't care whether he insults the questioner or not. So you'll certainly get this yin and yang where Warren is being very tactful, and Charlie is almost saying to Warren, you know, you don't mean that. The really truth is this. It's a very interesting conversation. What happened in 2008 is as close as ever happened, leaving aside the depression of the 30s, to the country's financial structure sort of falling apart. This country depends on prompt payments. There's a system out there in which everybody is expected to pay what they owe, and for the most part they do. And Wall Street is probably the epitome of this. And we were very close in 2008, in September 2008 specifically, to that whole structure breaking down. And heroic efforts by a lot of people managed to prevent this from happening. But I don't think most people realize how really terrible it was. I was talking to him some on the phone. He was getting calls from various people seeking help. He knew it was very, very bad. I don't recall that he ever said, we've got 2 days, or otherwise we're going to have a disaster. But he knew it was bad, and he was talking to everybody, and he was getting calls from people like Tim Geithner in Washington. The Secretary of the Treasury was calling him about very, very important things. And the dialogue between the two of them was going to determine a lot of what happened in the country. Well, I don't think he does anything without some sort of purpose or the belief that it will be to the good. And he knew that his was a voice that would be important in the dialogue. And then I also believe that he thought that the right actions would be taken in Washington, because to contemplate that they wouldn't be taken was to lead to disaster. And so he himself was optimistic that the right strategies were going to be formed and carried out. Well, derivatives are securities whose value is derived from some other benchmark, like the value of a stock. A stock option, for example, is a derivative. It is a means by which one financial party transfers risk to another financial party. But an important thing about it is that the risk doesn't go away, it's changed hands. Guy A has gotten it out of his hands and transferred it to guy B, but the risk is still there and still something that kind of hangs over the economy. And as derivatives have exploded, they are a huge force in the financial world. And Warren does not think well of them. He has called them weapons of mass destruction. Right. Well, I learned that Warren was going to give away. Well, it was always apparent after Susie's death that Warren suddenly had a problem on his hand that he hadn't anticipated. he was going to have to be the person who determined where his fortune, how it would be allocated. He hadn't expected this, but there wasn't anybody else to do it, so he was going to have to deal with it. I heard him talk about it a little in conversations we had after Susie died, but I then think I just got a call from him and said, "Well, I've made the decision. I'm going to give most of my money to the Gates Foundation." And I said, "We'd like to write about that." And so Fortune did do the story that broke that news. Well, I definitely think that each one of those four foundations is carrying out purposes, missions that Susie would have approved of. And absolutely, I know quite a lot about the foundations of the three children. They have all risen. The children have risen to the occasion. The work they're doing is wonderful, and I know very personally the work of the Susan T. Buffett Foundation, and I can say that its mission is being carried out well. Susie would have loved it all. The Susan Thompson Buffett Foundation does not go around seeking out the press, and it probably is not known to a lot of people, but I would say it's known to quite a few too, and heaven knows the information is publicly available. There's no problem about finding out what any foundation is doing. I feel very privileged to have known Warren, and to have played an important a role in anyway, maybe important in working with him on his annual letter, because he regards that as a part of his legacy. And it's not only I've been a privilege to work with him on that and to maybe help just a little bit make it better, but not much because the content of it is entirely his. And I feel that even if he didn't, everybody needs an editor, but even if he hadn't had an editor, this letter would have been famous. And also just to have had the chance to play bridge and to be at social occasions, because I was in a group that every 2 years met, which I always called the Buffett group, although it had a very it had a very it had a wide range of names, but it was essentially the only way you could describe this group was Friends of Warren Buffett. So I always thought the Buffett group. And to have been a part of a life as big as Warren's is a wonder for anybody who ever managed to enjoy that. I've been very lucky in that. Well, I don't see how anybody could perform with the excellence that Warren has and Charlie has had in a slightly less important position. Um, they have been such great leaders of that company that I don't know how anybody can follow that. It's a tough act to follow if ever there was one. However, Berkshire is a bunch of assets, is a collection of assets that is really wonderful. And I know that I've heard Charlie say again and again, I've told my kids not to sell because this company is going to thrive on and on. And I think that is probably right. The assets are so wonderful. Well, my very favorite Buffett rule is don't in investing. Rule number one is don't lose money, and rule number two is don't forget the first rule. So I love that. No, I don't think I've experienced his tough side, but I do know that that he has that reputation as being tough with some of his managers, and I've heard about that. And I know of one who uh, I know com- almost complained or certainly commented about the fact that how tough and maybe even harsh, strict he was in dealing with. But I have not seen that personally. Well, I'm not certain that there has ever been um, more brain power employed in a more creative way than Warren has uh, expended on Berkshire. He has never allowed himself to be trapped in any kind of formulaic way. He has been opportunistic, and there have been lots of opportunities that have come along, and he has created some, and some he has seized. And and he all through this, he has had a devotion of one idea. He wants to make Berkshire better, and it is something that for 50 years now, that's been his every thought when he gets up in the morning. What can I do? If there's a business happening? What can we? How will this affect us? What can we glean from this? And if you're spending 50 years with pretty much 100% of your very high intelligence and energy focused on one ambition, it's probably not surprising that the company has grown into the fourth largest in the country. The companies that form Berkshire are a collection of good businesses, um, as identified by a man who undoubtedly has one of the great minds for business that ever existed. The companies in the Standard & Poor's 500 are just everybody who's in the Standard & Poor's 500, and some of these are not good businesses. And some of these are companies that Warren would not even have gotten close to, considering belonged to be, would not have come close to realizing to thinking should be in in this group of carefully chosen companies that Berkshire has become. I think investors who own Berkshire Hathaway in general feel good about themselves because they bought a company that has grown in a way that has distinguished it in the business enterprise, in the business environment, and they can't think of anything bad about being a Berkshire shareholder. They see themselves as a part of a community. They see Warren and Charlie as the leaders. Uh, they see a great reputation. They know that to say I've been a Berkshire shareholder for a number of years is a credit to themselves, and I think they're just people who relish being in this community.